The storm that night was unlike any the Lakota elders had ever seen. Lightning split the sky in 4 directions at once, and the thunder that followed shook the earth so deeply that people pressed their hands to the ground just to feel something steady beneath them. Rain came down in thick silver sheets, and the smell of burned wood and wet grass filled the air. It was in the middle of that storm, in a small buffalo hide lodge on the banks of the White River, that a woman named Morning Star gave birth to a boy. She had been in labor for 2 full days. The medicine woman had burned sage, sung old songs, and prayed to every spirit she knew. When the boy finally came, he did not cry. He opened his eyes, dark, still, and startlingly alert, and looked up at the smoke hole in the roof as if he already understood something that no one else in the room could see. Morning Star wept. The medicine woman whispered a prayer. Outside, the thunder rolled again, long and low, like a voice giving its blessing. They named him Chayton, which means falcon. But the old men who gathered the next morning to hear of his birth said the name was too small for what had come into the world. They said the boy carried something in his chest that was older than any of them, something that did not belong to one person but to all the people. The eldest among them, a man with white hair and clouded eyes, pressed one finger to the boy's forehead and said simply, "He will carry a great weight." Then he walked away without another word. Chayton grew the way a young tree grows near a river, fast, strong, and shaped by forces he did not choose. His father was a warrior named Red Elk, a man who said very little but whose silences spoke volumes. Red Elk taught his son how to read the land, how to follow the path of a deer through snow without making a sound, and how to sit with discomfort without running from it. These were lessons given not in words but in action, through long days of hard work and quiet observation. Chayton absorbed every one of them. By the time he was 12, Chayton could ride a horse with the ease of a man twice his age. He could track, hunt, and navigate by the stars. But what truly set him apart from the other boys was his ability to listen. While others laughed and played, Chayton sat with the old ones and absorbed their stories like dry ground absorbs rain. He did not ask many questions. He simply listened, and he remembered everything. There was a girl in the village named Wren. She had sharp eyes and a laugh that could be heard 3 lodges away. She threw rocks at boys who annoyed her and helped her grandmother carry water without being asked. Chayton noticed her the way you notice a fire on a cold night. Not suddenly but gradually, warmth spreading before you even realize you have moved closer. They were too young to speak of it. But something was already being woven between them, thread by quiet thread. When Chayton was 14, a crow raiding party struck the southern edge of the camp just before dawn. They came silently, moving through the dark like ghosts. Red Elk was among the first to respond. He grabbed his weapons and ran toward the sound of hooves without hesitation. Chayton, heart hammering, followed him. He had no weapon except a short hunting knife. What he saw that morning, the screaming horses, the blood on the ground, his father fighting with every breath in his body, changed something in him permanently. The world cracked open and a harder, sharper version of reality poured in. Red Elk survived that raid. But 3 other men did not. Chayton helped carry their bodies back through the camp as the sun came up, and he looked at each face carefully. He did not look away. He made himself see it. Because he already understood at 14, that a leader who could not face death would never be able to protect life. The storm had given him something at birth. Now the world was teaching him how to use it. The years between boyhood and manhood passed like water over stone, shaping Chayton slowly, smoothing away the soft parts, leaving something harder and more defined in their place. He became a warrior at 17 after his first formal raid, returning with 3 horses and a long scar across his left forearm that he wore without pride or shame. It was simply part of him now. Part of the record written on his body. War on the plains in those years was not a distant thing. It lived in the camp, in the conversations of elders, in the eyes of women who scanned the horizon every evening before they slept. The Lakota were a strong and proud people, but strength does not exist in a vacuum. It must be defended, renewed, and sometimes paid for in blood. Chayton understood this better than most. He had grown up watching his father hold the line between safety and chaos, and he had made a silent promise to himself that he would one day do the same. At 22, Chayton led his first war party. It was a retaliatory strike against a band that had stolen horses and killed 2 young scouts from their camp. The men who rode with him were experienced and dangerous, and several of them were older than he was. Leading them required more than courage. It required presence, the kind that makes a man pause and consider before acting, the kind that settles a room without raising a voice. Chayton had it. He was not sure how or why, but it was there and the men felt it. The raid was successful. They recovered the stolen horses and returned without losing a single man. When they rode back into camp, there was no loud celebration. Chayton dismounted quietly, handed his horse to a younger boy and went to see his mother. That was what the elders noticed. Not the victory, every warrior hoped for victory, but what a man did with it. The way Chayton set it down and walked away told them more than the raid itself. But the world was changing in ways that no raid, no victory, no careful preparation could fully address. Stories began arriving from the east like smoke carried on the wind. Strange men in metal and cloth. Weapons that roared like thunder and killed from great distances. Treaties written in a language no Lakota elder had ever learned, signed and broken before the ink was dry. Chayton listened to these stories with the same stillness he had always carried, but inside something tightened like a bowstring pulled too far. The first time he saw soldiers in the distance, a long line of blue against the horizon. He was 24 years old, standing on a ridge with the wind pressing against his chest. He watched them for a long time without moving. He counted their numbers, studied their formation, noted the direction they traveled and the pace they kept. He did not feel fear. What he felt was something closer to grief, the grief of a man who can already see a storm coming and knows that no amount of preparation will make it painless. He rode back to camp and requested a council. He was young to make such a request, but the elders granted it because they had been watching him for years and trusted what he brought. He spoke for a long time that night, laying out what he had seen and what he believed it meant. He did not exaggerate and he did not minimize. He told the truth, and the truth was heavy enough without embellishment. Some of the older warriors disagreed with his assessment. They believed the soldiers could be fought off, pushed back, that the Lakota had held their land through generations of conflict and would hold it still. Chayton did not argue with them. He simply said, "I hope you are right," and sat down. Because he was not yet chief. He was still a young man learning the difference between being right and being wise. The fire of actual war came 3 years later, when a skirmish at a river crossing turned into a massacre that no one had intended and no one could stop once it started. Chayton fought that day with everything inside him. He saw men die on both sides. He saw the moment when violence becomes its own kind of river, rushing, unstoppable, carving new channels through the world. He survived. Many did not. And when it was over, he sat alone at the edge of the water for a long time, watching the current carry the blood downstream, his hands still shaking, his mind already moving toward what came next. Because for a man like Chayton, there was always a next. The fire had not consumed him. It had forged him. He became chief in his 29th year, not through conquest or politics but through loss. The man who had led their band for a decade, a warrior named Standing Wolf, was struck by sickness in the deep winter, a burning fever that took him in 4 days despite everything the healers tried. It was swift and cruel and left the camp without an anchor in the most dangerous season of the year. The elders met in the lodge of the oldest woman among them, a person called Grandmother Cedar, who was so old that no one could remember a time before her. She sat wrapped in a thick robe, her eyes half closed, listening as the men debated names and qualities and histories. The debate went on for 2 days. On the third morning, Grandmother Cedar opened her eyes fully, looked directly at the entrance of the lodge and said, "You already know." Every person in that circle turned toward the same name at the same moment. And so it was decided. Chayton was brought the eagle feather that evening. It was handed to him in silence by one of the oldest warriors, a man who had seen 4 chiefs come and go. The warrior placed the feather in Chayton's hand, held his gaze for a long moment, and then walked away without speaking. The weight of it was nothing. A feather weighs almost nothing at all. But Chayton stood there in the winter cold, holding it with both hands as if it were made of stone, because he understood what it represented. Every life in the camp. Every child, every elder, every prayer made beside every fire. He was responsible for all of it now. The first test came quickly. A bitter cold snap pushed the buffalo herds far south, and the camp's food stores were lower than they should have been because of the chaos of the previous months. People were hungry. Children were crying in the night. Old people gave their portions to the young without being asked, which made the young people feel guilty, which created a kind of quiet tension that Chayton could feel pressing against the walls of every lodge he entered. He organized hunting parties that moved further south than the camp had ever sent them. He redistributed the remaining food stores himself, walking lodge to lodge with careful notes kept in his memory of who had what and who needed more. He stayed up later than anyone and rose earlier than anyone. He made decisions with imperfect information in the freezing dark and accepted that some of them would be wrong. When they were wrong, he corrected course without wasting energy on regret. The camp survived that winter. Spring came with its usual reluctant grace. A few warm days, then cold again, then warmth finally settling in like a promise kept. The people emerged from their lodges thinner and quieter than they had gone in, but alive. They looked at their new chief with a different kind of attention than they had given him before. Not just respect, which they had already given him. Something deeper. Something closer to trust. It was in that spring that he finally spoke to Ren. She was no longer the sharp-eyed girl who threw rocks at boys. She was a woman of 26, still sharp-eyed, still possessed of a laugh that could fill a space completely. She had survived a difficult marriage that had ended in her husband's early death, and she carried that experience the way strong people carry heavy things, not pretending it was light but not letting it stop her either. They spoke for the first time alone beside the river. It was not romantic in the way stories sometimes make such things. It was honest. He told her he had thought of her for years without knowing what to do with the thought. She told him she had noticed, which made him smile in spite of himself. She said she was not interested in a man who needed her to be less than she was, and he said he was not interested in a woman who needed him to pretend the world was easier than it was. They sat in silence after that for a while, listening to the water, understanding that something had just been settled between them. The weight of the feather was still there. It would always be there. But beside her, it felt for the first time like something he could carry all the way to the end. The summer of his 33rd year brought the worst of what he had long feared. The soldiers came not as a distant line on the horizon but as an immediate reality, camped just 2 days' ride from the sacred hills where the Lakota buried their dead and made their prayers. The hills were not just land. They were the spine of the world, the place where sky and earth met, where the voices of ancestors could still be heard if you listened in the right way. And now soldiers were there with maps and tools, drawing lines around things that did not belong to them. Chayton called a great council. People came from 3 bands: warriors, elders, mothers, fathers, medicine people. They filled the largest lodge and still spilled outside into the evening air. He stood at the center and spoke without raising his voice, because he had learned long ago that a quiet voice in a loud room carries further than a shout. He laid out the situation plainly. He described what the soldiers had done, what they had said through their interpreters, and what he believed they intended to do next. The warriors wanted to fight immediately. Their anger was righteous and hot and completely understandable, and Chayton felt it himself like a burning in his own chest. But he also knew what the army had that they did not just numbers and weapons, but the endless machinery of a distant government that could send more soldiers as fast as the first ones were defeated. He had learned this from careful listening and from the accounts of other nations who had chosen open war and been broken by it. He proposed a different strategy. Not surrender, he would never propose surrender. But resistance through movement, through protection of the most vulnerable, through careful selection of when and where to fight. He argued for preserving the people first, the land second, because without the people the land had no meaning. Some of the warriors heard this as cowardice. He let them speak their anger. He did not interrupt and he did not defend himself. When they were finished he said, "I want to fight them as much as you do. But I want to win more than I want to fight." Not everyone agreed. A group of younger warriors, led by a fierce man named Hawkfeather, broke away and launched their own attack on a soldier's supply column 3 days later. The attack succeeded in destroying the supplies. It also brought immediate and overwhelming retaliation down on a small camp 2 miles away from Chayton's band, a camp full of elders and children who had nothing to do with the raid. 19 people died. Chayton rode to the site after the soldiers had gone and walked through it slowly, looking at everything. He did not look away. He never looked away. He buried the dead with his own hands, working alongside others in silence. When it was done, he sat at the edge of the burial ground as the sun went down and the sky turned the color of a wound, deep red and orange and a purple that felt almost violent. He thought about Hawkfeather, who was not evil, who had been brave and passionate and completely wrong. He thought about the 19 people who had paid for that passion with their lives. He thought about the soldiers who had killed them, who were themselves someone's sons and brothers following orders from people who sat in rooms far away and never had to see the bodies. He thought about Ren, who was pregnant with their first child. About what world he was bringing that child into. He returned to camp and found Hawkfeather waiting for him, head down, shoulders carrying the full weight of what had happened. Chayton stood before him in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "You carry those 19 lives now. You will carry them always. That is your punishment and your responsibility. Do not waste it." He walked past him and into his lodge and he did not speak of it again. The blood on the sacred ground did not wash away with rain. It seeped in. It became part of the earth, part of the memory that the land holds long after the people who spilled it have turned to dust. Chayton knew this. He had always known this. But knowing a truth and living inside it are two completely different things, and that summer he learned the full weight of the difference. The years that followed were years of endurance. Not the dramatic, story-worthy kind, not battles with clear victors and clean endings, but the hard, grinding kind that asks everything of a person and offers nothing in return except survival. The Lakota were pushed further and further, their world shrinking like a fire in wet weather, reduced from the endless open plains they had always known to boundaries drawn by people who had never stood on that ground. Chayton's daughter was born in the second year after the massacre, a strong, loud child who entered the world fighting and never stopped. He held her on the first night of her life and felt something move through him that was different from everything else he had ever felt. Not the cold clarity of leadership. Not the hot pressure of war. Something quieter and more terrifying, love of the kind that has no armor, no strategy, no defense. He named her Sky because when he looked at her he thought of something vast and endless, something that could not be contained. Ren watched him hold the baby and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Now you understand what the rest of us have always known." He looked up at her. She said, "This is what we have always been protecting. Not the land. Not the honor. This." He held his daughter tighter and understood that his wife had always been wiser than him in the ways that mattered most. He continued to lead through negotiations that rarely produced what was promised, through winters that took the weakest members of the community, through disagreements within his own people that were sometimes harder to navigate than any external enemy. He made mistakes. He misjudged situations and misjudged people and sometimes chose the wrong path in the dark and had to find his way back. He was not perfect. He had never claimed to be. He claimed only to try and to keep trying, and to be honest about the difference between what he wanted and what was real. There was a day in his 41st year, when a young soldier came to the camp under a flag of peace with a message from the government. The soldier was barely 20, clearly frightened, clearly aware that he was surrounded by people who had excellent reasons to want him dead. He delivered his message: more restrictions, more reductions, more promises that would not be kept, and then stood waiting, unable to hide the fear in his hands. Chayton looked at him for a long time. He thought about Hawk Feather. He thought about the 19 graves. He thought about the endless machinery of the distant government that kept grinding forward regardless of what any one person on either side believed or felt. And then he said to the soldier, in the young man's own language, which he had taught himself over many years of careful listening, "Tell them we heard. Tell them we are still here." The soldier left. Chayton watched him ride away and thought about what it meant to still be here. To have lost so much and still be standing. To have buried the dead and continued moving and kept the fire lit through every cold season that tried to kill it. To have loved someone deeply in the middle of all of it, and to have been loved back. To have held a daughter in his hands and known that whatever came next, something of who he was would continue forward into a world he would never fully see. He walked back into camp and found Ren sitting outside their lodge watching Sky, now 9 years old, argue passionately with two older boys over the rules of a game. Sky was losing the argument on points but winning it on force of will, refusing to concede anything, her voice rising with magnificent indignation. Ren looked at Chayton with a quiet smile. He sat down beside her. Their shoulders touched. The sun was warm. Chayton had walked through fire and blood and grief and war and cold and loss and love. He had carried the weight of an eagle feather that felt like stone. He had made decisions in the dark with shaking hands and lived with the consequences without running. He had not saved everything he wanted to save. No one ever does. But he had never stopped trying, and he had never turned his face away from the truth, no matter how difficult it was to look at directly. The fire was still burning. The people were still here. Sky was still arguing, loud and fierce and alive. Ren's shoulder was warm against his. Above them the sky was enormous and open and full of the kind of light that asks nothing from you except to be present in it. And Chayton, the boy born in thunder, the warrior forged in fire, the chief who had walked through everything this world had to offer and kept walking, he was present. Completely, quietly, fully present. That, in the end, was the only victory that had ever truly mattered.